Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is women in the 19th century or first wave feminism. Now, as always, before we get started, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline, pay particular attention to those keywords at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, coming out of the Second Great Awakening, as we have noted, there were a number of these major reform efforts. We talked about things, we mentioned public education, we talked at length about temperance movement. We will talk about the abolitionist movement in coming weeks. And while we noted that women played a major role in all of these reform movements, another of these major reform movements was, in fact, a women's rights movement, aka first wave feminism. Now, last time we talked about women, specifically about women, it was at the end of the revolution. And it was in that lecture, Who Really Won the Revolution? And we noted that while they were not the biggest losers after the American Revolution, they did not get that hallmark of citizenship, i.e., suffrage, the right to vote. Rather, they had to settle for what was articulated by Abigail Adams, Republican motherhood. And while we mentioned women in the context of those moral suasion movements of the Second Great Awakening, things like the abolition or the temperance movement, we also saw them begin to push outside the bounds of the so-called cult of domesticity. They were heavily involved in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, with the idea of the kind of first industrial revolution. They were majorly involved in all of these reform movements. But the thing is, women in the 19th century were not just about these tangential things. They still never lost focus. They never forgot their own exclusion in society. You have to understand, women were never true citizens. And not just because they couldn't vote. Women didn't even have actual citizenship. Because if a woman was born in the United States, she was married to an American citizen husband, yes, it was assumed that she was a US citizen, even though she could not vote. But did you know, up until almost the 1920s, throughout much of the world, a woman's citizenship status followed that of her husband. So if a US born woman who had a US born husband, presumed to be a US citizen then, but that US born husband dies and she were to remarry, say, a person from Japan, well, that woman automatically became a Japanese citizen. Let's say that couple then moved to Japan and the husband died. That woman is now stuck in Japan, recognized as a Japanese citizen with no real appeal to the United States to come back home. She becomes essentially another immigrant trying to enter the country. In addition, in most states, women could not own property. They could not own a business. They could not buy and sell. Let's not even get started on the fact that until the 1980s, women in most places were not allowed to own a credit card in their own name. They could not go into a department store like Sears or J.C. Penney, or back then Montgomery Ward, and purchase an appliance like a washing machine or a refrigerator without their husband's consent and approval. That was women's status. Now, that's the setup for today's lecture. Now, as we go on here, I want to talk about that even women in the 19th century, again, that's what we're talking about, 19th century here, understand women are not a homogenous category. There are different degrees of the hierarchy within women. Because at the top, you have your rich elite women, like people like Abigail Adams, we talked about previously. You have your middle class women. You have your lower class poor women. You have your immigrant women. Then, of course, you have your black women. Then you have your enslaved black women. In other words, women were not even equal to each other. So I want to start here first with enslaved women, because enslaved black women were in the most precarious situation of all. And I want to start with Sally Hemings. Now, you may have heard of her. She was referred to in most often context as Thomas Jefferson's mistress. Now, mistress in itself can have a negative connotation because it's assumed that's an extramarital affair, but it's also assumed that, well, boys will be boys. And it was semi-common for rich males, especially those, when you think about like kingdoms of Europe, kings would often have mistresses or concubines. But I want to dispel a couple myths and innuendos here. Sally Hemings is not a mistress. A mistress usually involves some type of consent. Now, there's a power dynamic normally between the wealthy and the poor. So there's usually a power disparity, where sometimes the woman feels she can't say no. But understand, Sally Hemings was enslaved. She was a child, and therefore she cannot consent. She had absolutely no choice. I believe it's unfair to call her even a mistress. Sally Hemings was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. Let's understand for a minute. Sally Hemings was born into slavery in Virginia. Now, after her enslaver died, the Hemings family was inherited by the daughter of her previous enslaver. The daughter's name was Martha, who then married Thomas Jefferson and then lived at Monticello. When Jefferson went to Paris as a U.S. diplomat in 1784, Sally went there too for 3 years as his companion and maid to Jefferson's 8-year-old daughter, Maria. Both Sally and her older brother, James, would live in Paris with Jefferson as Jefferson's personal servant. Now, they were technically paid a monthly wage there due to French laws. But it's during this time that Jefferson began a relationship. It's also this time when Sally Hemings became pregnant. Now, there are some sympathizers, apologists, who would argue this is a good thing, because it showed that Jefferson was treating her, well, as more human, as more of a person. But when I say relationship, I mean sexual. And again, I want to drive this point home. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse any sexual advance, wanted or unwanted. In other words, Sally Hemings could not refuse Jefferson's advancements under fear of punishment. Now, some have said, well, she was listed as a servant in Paris. Okay, true. But understand, she was still enslaved. If they'd been living in the United States, she would have been enslaved. She was also only 16. She was underage. She was a child. She was a teenager. Now, to be clear, Sally Hemings did try to leverage some type of control from this relationship. She negotiated with Jefferson to return herself to enslavement in exchange for extraordinary privileges for herself. In other words, she would be given more freedoms, again, quotations, when they returned back to Monticello. She also tried to negotiate for freedom for her unborn children. In other words, she said, hey, Mr. Jefferson, sir, when we go back to the United States, I will continue being enslaved by you. But in exchange for that, I want my children to be free and I want to have extra privileges. Because she did have babies. In fact, all her babies were born in a very small room. All 6 of them. Now, technically, of the 6, 2 did die, 4 would live. She raised the 4 children for years because Daddy promised them emancipation once they were grown. To be clear, Sally Hemings was never freed, nor did she negotiate her freedom. And despite fathering these mixed race kids, Jefferson argued against racial mixing because, in his words, Black people were, quote, inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind, unquote. It is true, in general, Jefferson did not fully agree with the institution of slavery, but he also enslaved over 600 people. Now, to be clear, he did not purchase most of them. He inherited most of them from his father-in-law. Now, there's been some historians, some scholars who argue that even if he wanted to, he could not free his enslaved. And there is some truth to that. You have to realize Thomas Jefferson was not a wealthy man. Yeah, he had a lot of power and prestige. He had high political appointments. He became president. But he was actually in debt. And Virginia law stated that if you were in debt and you tried to emancipate your enslaved people, in other words, free the enslaved, that your creditors who you owed money to could actually take back those enslaved people or re-enslave them and sell them off to pay your debt. So technically speaking, there's an argument to be made that Jefferson may not have been able to free most of his enslaved people, legally speaking, because if he had, they'd be re-enslaved anyway to pay off his debt. And so maybe, again, I don't actually believe this, but maybe they could be better treated by him than they would a different enslaver. Again, there's an argument, there's a story, there's a nuance there, but it's still a fact that he enslaved. And in this case, after Jefferson's death, 2 of Sally Hemings' children were allowed to leave Monticello for freedom, and 2 more were freed in his will. So the 4 children who lived would have been free, even though 2 of them were only formally emancipated, again, through his will. The other 2 were just allowed to leave. They were never formally freed. Now, Martha, Jefferson's wife, would eventually give Sally Hemings her time. She would list Sally Hemings as free starting in 1826. And she would move to a house in Charlottesville where she would die in 1835. So for about the last 12 years of her life, when she was older, she would be allowed to live as a free woman. But let's be very clear once again. Sally Hemings was a sex slave. Jefferson was raping her. Let's be very clear. crystal clear what this relationship was. Being enslaved meant that Sally Hemings could not truly consent. And not being able to consent to sex means she was raped. That she was just 16 years of age when it started means it was statutory rape. That's a big deal. Now, the story doesn't quite end there, though. A few years ago, there was a large Jefferson family reunion where all the members of the Jefferson clan had a big family reunion at Monticello. And when that meeting was called, a large number of descendants of the Hemings family attempted to come, arguing they were, well, Jefferson's descendants. But they were refused entry. Now, let's be very clear. Again, this is not black and white here, right? This is not all or nothing. While they were not allowed to enter, some of the Jefferson line did side with the Hemings descendants. In fact, the Monticello estate is not even homogenous. There's actually two separate Jefferson lineage organizations. One's called the Monticello Association, which is separate from the Monticello estate. So as these descendants were gathered on the Monticello estate, they were denied entry. But the Monticello Association would vote to allow the Hemings family to be buried alongside other Jefferson descendants at the family graveyard. So again, finally, in the last decade, there has been some progress of reconciling this idea that Jefferson fathered a large number of African American children. But what does this tell us about this era? Well, for enslaved African American women, there's no progress being made here. But it didn't stop African American women from trying. Again, we saw Sally Hemings trying to negotiate some type of, well, better treatment. If not for herself, at least for her kids. But while that's the case for the majority of African American women in the United States, it was different, though, for white women. You see, in middle class and elite white families, women were taught that their proper place was in the household, raising good, patriotic, pious children, making a peaceful refuge for their husbands. Ideally, in their perfect world, wives occupied the domestic realm. They left politics and finances to their husbands. It was in these middle-class families that the whole so-called domestic sphere of the middle and upper-class women, that they were subordinate to the public sphere of men. In other words, there was a hierarchy. Men were on top, women were below. The public sphere was greater than the domestic sphere. So for these women who were born in these households, people like Susan B. Anthony, who are educated, they are religious, life was highly gendered and quite narrow. Now, I want to make a little asterisk here, a notation, and this is very important to understand. These societal values that women belong in the domestic sphere, men in the public sphere, this very gendered, narrow patriarchy view, this idea only really applied to middle and upper class white women. It was commonly understood that these values did not apply to African American women who were largely enslaved, did not apply to immigrant women, did not apply to poorer white women. You understand, the economic realities of their lives made adopting this societal values highly unlikely. And again, in the case of Black women, the great majority of whom were enslaved, their labor was exploited at the same level as that of, well, enslaved men. Again, see Sally Hemings. It's always interesting to think about this idea that the so-called proper role of women was at the house. And they argue this was a sign of respect or respectability in society based on race and class. But even poor white women never had to do this. First of all, they had to work in order to feed their families. It took the entire family working to just stay afloat, not starve to death. But also understand that even middle and upper class society didn't really expect poor women to not work. They depended upon their exploited labor. The US economy depended on the fact that these African American women were enslaved. The economy depended on the fact that poor white women, poor immigrant women would also be working. Because if they didn't work, well, the rich and middle class wouldn't be able to have their lives how they wanted. The US economy would not function. They could not have their, well, perfect society. So you understand, the majority of what we're talking about next is referring to middle and upper class white women. They're the ones that had the time to begin to try to push the boundaries. And so this advocacy by women was limited by both race and class, and to a lesser degree by region. Understand that the majority of women in America did not identify with the issues of people like Susan B. Anthony or those like her, the women you see on your screen. But these feminists, these founders of first wave feminism, they wanted to claim citizenship in a young nation who was already undergoing major political and cultural changes in this post-market revolution, this second Great Awakening era. Remember, coming out of the second Great Awakening, there was this new impetus, this new push for reform. As democracy and voting began to expand in the 1820s, as we discussed with Jacksonian America, women began to ask the question, well, why not them? Why can't they vote too? The Second Great Awakening embraced the more emotional, individualistic religious experience, and more women than men were embracing this evangelicalism, which, along with the emotional display of the conversion experience, led historians to what historians have called the feminization of American Christianity. Now, again, I said this is also by region. In the North, this was much more apparent than in the South, which the Second Great Awakening was more about preservation and traditionalism. So the majority of what we're going to talk about next is middle and upper class white women in the North, especially New England. And so middle class women began to take part in all these reform efforts. We already spoke about their personal stake in the temperance movement, wanting to avoid being beaten. But they were also very concerned about their own citizenship rights, that is, voting. And we refer to this era as the start of first wave feminism. This first wave really begins in earnest in the 1840s, in the wake of the Second Great Awakening. This story includes the traditional leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And yes, they are very important. I don't want to downplay their role, but they were not alone. I understand they are not the only people doing this. These women fought for more than 50 years for basic rights for women. Things like to own property, to be able to divorce abusive husbands. Remember, men could divorce for any reason, women could not. So, own property, divorce their abusive husbands, to claim custody of minor children, to collect wages, and of course, to vote. Now, while it was definitely not the very first thing ever, the movement officially kind of gets their big launching point on July 19th, July 20th, 1848, at what's called the Seneca Falls Convention. A group of women met in Seneca Falls, New York, for what became known as the Seneca Falls Convention on July 19th and 20th, 1848. Now, on the first day of the event, it was only open to women. Some 300 women attended. The second day, July 20th, was open to men also. Now, Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was one of the organizers of the event, and she got up and stated the goals and purpose of this convention. She says, you see the quote on the screen, "We are assembled to protest a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be as free as man is free, to be represented by the government, which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in the case of separation, the children of her love." There's a lot to unpack in that statement. Number one is that she's calling back those revolutionary values, calling back the idea of the government that is formed with the consent of the governed, harking back to the words of Alexander Hamilton during the Federalist Papers, arguing that men are able to take what is theirs, take the property that they are supposed to inherit, take the children they should own, that they should have and raise. Just make a note here, too. Susan B. Anthony was not at this convention. She would not meet Stanton for another 3 years. At the Seneca Falls Convention, they would give what was called the Declaration of Sentiments. This was like a manifesto that would describe women's grievances and demands. Written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it harkened back to the founding of the United States, saying, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed," unquote. And then she went on to assert women's equality in politics, in family, in education, in jobs, in religion, and morality. She said that because women have the right to vote, a right that was given to, in her words, quote, "the most ignorant and degraded men," unquote. No, she's saying, wait, you're giving poor white men the right to vote who are ignorant, they are stupid, their vote can be bought. They're voting for people who pass laws. Those laws that affect us, but we have no right in that vote. The women were being forced to submit to laws which they did not consent, they did not vote for. Women were denied an education and issued inferior roles in churches. Now, to be clear, not everyone believed this was a good thing. The response to Seneca Falls was sometimes harsh. In the Mechanics Advocate, many scoffed at this idea, saying, quote, "We are sorry to see that the women in several parts of the state are holding what they call a women's rights conference and setting forth a formidable list of those rights in a parody upon the Declaration of American Independence. The women who attend these meetings, no doubt at the expense of their more appropriate duties, the House, they act as committees. They write resolutions and addresses. Now, it requires no argument to prove this is all wrong. Every true-hearted female, notice the appeal here that they're not being real women. Every true-hearted female will instantly feel it is unwomanly, and that to be practically carried out, the males must change their position in society to the same extent in the opposite direction, or feminize the males, make men more womanly, in order to enable them to discharge an equal share of the domestic duties which now appertain to females. But this change is impracticable, uncalled for, and unnecessary. If effected, it would demoralize and degrade the high sphere noble destiny. Women of all respectable and useful classes improve a monstrous injury to all mankind. unquote. Notice the common appeal here, especially that middle section, that males would have to be reduced, become more feminine to make a way for women. Guys, this is a common refrain in history, especially from white male elites. That continues all the way to the present day, by the way. That whenever a group of people begins to demand for more rights and equality, they begin to argue that their elite male equality will somehow be diminished, be reduced, that their status is going to be inhibited and lowered by extending equality to new groups. Now, understand that's not how equality works. Notice also the appeal to the feminization to men, that you will, turn men into essentially grilly men. The term that they used was demoralize. That's the same argument that we heard in the 1990s about having gays serve openly in the military, that it will feminize and demoralize our military. They're not real men because they're performing other ways. And this is not a new argument we hear nowadays. This is an argument that is old as time. But while there were those, like you see here on the screen, that scoffed at these women who wanted equal rights, there were some men who began to take them a little more seriously. People like Horace Greeley. He was a very influential editor of the New York Tribune newspaper. He echoed the opinion of many at the time. Yeah, he was skeptical of giving women the right to vote. But he did argue that if Americans really believed in the Constitution, women should attain equal rights. He said, quote, when a sincere Republican, and again, this is not Republican Party, this is lowercase r. When a sincere Republican is asked to say in sober earnest what adequate reason he can give for refusing the demand of women to equal participation with men in political rights, he must answer, none at all. However unwise and mistaken the demand, it is but the assertion of natural rights and such must be conceded. Notice the change here. From when last time we discussed women in totality, how women fared after the revolution. When they posed the issue of natural rights back then, in the 1780s, it was simply ignored. This time, however, while the long fight still remained, at least some people were beginning to take notice. Now, while Stanton and Anthony are indeed important to this discussion, I do want to look at some other women today as well. But for now, we're going to stop here. We'll pick it up in the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.